Welcome back, everyone. Before the break, we reflected on the changing nature of FIMI. In this section, we'll look at what can be done about it through multilateral action, and we have a fantastic panel to discuss that. Phil Howard from the Oxford Internet Institute is the co-founder of the International Panel on the Information Environment. Leah Zuber from CNECT is part of the European Commission concerned with shaping Europe's digital future. Charles Baubion is from the OECD, and Damien Tambini from the LSE London School of Economics will give us an academic viewpoint. So to start off with, each of our panelists will say a few words, starting with Phil. Phil, what is to be done?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. It is a difficult challenge, what to be done, and we've been instructed to land on a hopeful note. So this is sort of a double challenge for us. I want to begin with relaying my favorite information operation, or at least the one that got me interested in this field. It was the one that was launched around when the Malaysian Airlines flight was shut down over the forests of Ukraine, and I was based in Budapest at the time, and watched as my Hungarian friends got multiple equally ridiculous stories. There was the story that Ukrainian democracy advocates had shot the plane down. There was the story that the Americans had shot the plane down. And then there was the story of the lost tank from World War II that had been stuck in the great forests of Ukraine and emerged confused and accidentally shot the plane down. And watching these stories disseminate over our networks of friends, colleagues in Budapest made me appreciate how pernicious they are, how much resistance there is and to the ridiculousness of these kinds of FIMI operations, the messages, but also that part of the strategy is not so much to seed one narrative, but to seed multiple, conflicting, equally ridiculous narratives, right? With the ultimate goal perhaps being confusion. And perhaps ultimately a lack of trust in our institutions. Now, one of the critiques I share with the colleagues on the first panel is that I do feel we're at the point of defending democracy. As scientists trying to represent the scientific community here, I would say many of us at the International Panel on the Information Environment are about trying to defend the Enlightenment, the process by which we gather evidence and disseminate it. The fact that we have a term, evidence-based policymaking, is inane, right? We shouldn't have to have that term, but here we are. So I'm a professor at the University of Oxford, but more importantly, I'm on leave, public service leave, to help with the IPIE. This is now an organization of some 500 scientists from over 75 countries. We tackle a range of information threats. But one of our first outputs was a study of what the policy responses to misinformation should be. And of the things I want to say to this question, what is to be done, don't be surprised, it's that we need more science. Because there is evidence about how to act, what to intervene, where to intervene, and as with the previous panel, or at least the ending point for the previous panel, for much of the evidence we gather, the intervention point is the social media platforms, right? It's the social media platforms that serve up large amounts of junk in the 2-3 days before people vote, or in the days immediately before and after a crisis. So based on 6,000 scientific papers collected over a 10-year period, right? The IPIE doesn't do original research, we do meta-analysis and systematic reviews. Based on years of scientific papers, there's 2 policy interventions that clearly work. Content flagging, so putting clear signals, even if it's red, yellow, green, straightforward signals about beside posts that are junk, that works. On trust, information retention, a whole bunch of information-related outputs. And then providing the correct, accurate information. And the correct, accurate information can't appear somewhere else on the site. It has to be side by side near the junk. Now, there's a range of other policy options, fact-checking, changing the ad models, real name verification. There isn't scientific evidence that those things work. They might work, But one of the problems we all face, I think from the scientific community and perhaps also from the policymaking community, is that the best data about FIMI is not available for the scientific community. It's not in the Library of Congress. It doesn't sit in the British Library. It's not available in the great libraries of Europe. It's in Silicon Valley, right? It's on the far side of Washington State in very secure bunkers. So the information that would help us with a whole host of problems, from teens and mental health to FIMI, isn't something that we can currently play with. So the role of the IPIE is to identify which domains of information, which things the firms could reasonably share with us in secure, safe, privacy-respecting ways that would help us spot junk in moments of crisis. We've seen AI play more of a role in generating misinformation during UK elections, during elections around the world. And we're about to release the third review, the third global survey of our expert pool on what they're working on and worried about. And again, this is a little over 500 scientists from around the world. Let me start with the dark side of things. So 3/4 of the world's scientific community as surveyed in this pool are more worried about the trajectory of things, what's going to happen next year. Each time we run this survey, more and more of the scientific community reports being concerned about the direction of travel. 3/4 of the sample surveyed also say the social media platforms are the points of intervention. This is where we get the data. This is where the aspirations for public life become code. They become the algorithms. That's the important point of intervention for the scientific community. And of the hopeful things to say, there is growing consensus that mandatory disclosure for AI-generated content is the policy intervention point that's most likely to help, especially during elections. And then regular systematic AI auditing, independent auditing, with auditing standards that are open and transparent and well agreed, not privately commissioned with the big four accounting houses. So in answer to this question, what is to be done, I would say there are things we do know how to do. The scientific community is even less well-funded than it was a year ago. So much of what we know in the policymaking sphere, the tool building, happens at the edge of the science. And the IPIE, we're based in Zurich, we're a relatively small team, but the IPIE also does tool building to get to these questions of how AI actually generates misinformation, where the accounts are housed. Our report from the summer on climate misinformation, again, some 2,500 papers about the generation of misinformation about climate news. The scientific community has known for a while that the origins of climate-related junk are St. Petersburg and Houston. This is not the IPIE saying it, or even me as one of its leadership. It's years worth of research. We all know academics. I could give a 20-hour version of this lecture, right, if needed, on the topics of FIMI. Getting us to generate the 100-page specialist document and then the 5-page summary for policymakers, which we release in 10 languages that actually says something punchy, that's the real challenge. That's the part of the work that needs to be done if we're going to get a handle on the multiple crises we face.
That's really interesting. Leah, listening to that,
yes.
What other specific ways the EU is thinking about tackling the evolving FIMI threats? So what's your answer to what is to be done?
Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me, and a pleasure to be here. So you were focusing on science. I will focus on regulation, because that's what we do in the European Union and the European Commission. So I will focus on the Digital Services Act, which is a framework containing a number of obligations for all intermediary services, but especially for very large online platforms, which of course covers social media, as you were mentioning. So this act has been in place since February 2024, so we are coming up to the second year anniversary, and I think it's an important piece of the puzzle of how we can deal with manipulation of information and FIMI. So basically the objective of the act is twofold. On the one hand, it protects users' fundamental fundamental rights enshrined in the Charter. And also a very important objective is that it empowers users, because I think, it gives users the tool, it makes them aware, but it also gives them then the tools to flag illegal content, to ask for this content to be taken down. And on the other hand, it asks the platforms to do a number of things. So first of all, they need to analyze and identify systemic risks that can stem from their, recommender systems, content moderation practices, terms and conditions. And these risks are focused on, as I mentioned already, illegal content, then any negative effects that could happen for fundamental rights, negative effects on civic discourse, on election processes, on public security. We also have gender-based violence, health, etc. So that's the first step. So we are asking for the platforms to identify these risks, and then, you could say even more importantly, we are asking them to put in place really effective measures to counter these risks, but that also need to be proportionate. I might, give you a few examples of these measures that we have in mind, especially when it comes to the elections, because that's, as you also said, quite crucial point in time when we would need to be dealing with these threats. And I think some of these you mentioned. So we are asking platforms to provide information from authorities next to some posts about elections. We would like, platforms also to work on strengthening media literacy, to be in contact with national authority, with civil society. Fact-checking, of course, plays a very crucial role in all this. We need to remove any financial incentives for this information or information that has been manipulated is being spread across the platforms. And then also when it comes to AI, making sure that the platforms have systems in place that can quickly detect false accounts, impersonation of candidates, fake engagement, and also amplification. So in this respect, we have some guidelines, we have a toolkit. The Commission has been organizing round tables with the national authorities in this respect in the many member states, because of course elections are for them. But these are some of the things that we have been asking from the platforms. If I still have a minute or
just 1 minute,
just
please.
1 minute, maybe then also to end on a hopeful note, just to say that I don't know if you were following the State of the Union speech of the President of the Commission. So we have the Democracy Shield coming up. I think now it's scheduled for the 13th of November, which will be an initiative that will look specifically at FIMI, at building resilience, raising awareness. I think there was even a network of European fact-checkers that was announced there. So maybe that's something to look forward to.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Charles Baubion from the OECD, which is a multilateral organisation uniting countries committed to democracy and market economy, crucially across Europe, but also the US and beyond. Given the remit of your organisation and the membership, how do you come to the question of what is to be done?
Well, thank you, Jessica, for your question, and many thanks also for the EAS for the kind invitation. It's my pleasure to be in London today. I mean, for an organization like the OECD, indeed, cooperation between Europe, but also across the Channel, across the Atlantic, and with also our members in Asia Pacific is critical on those topics. So at the OECD, we have set up 3 years back what we call the OECD Hub on information integrity, which emanates from our Reinforcing Democracy initiative. And as a result of discussions with all our member states, there's been a significant milestone last December, with the adoption of this OECD recommendation on information integrity, which is basically a standard that OECD members and also other adhering countries sort of commit to implement, and that we as the Secretariat will support and evaluate in a few years' time. So this recommendation, in a sense, is the first multilateral standard on this topic, and was built on the in-depth analysis that we conducted with a report called Facts Not Fakes, published in 2024. And the approach that we take is really rooted in efforts to uphold freedom of expression. And it aims, of course, to help governments identifying their precise and constructive role in the information sphere without creating or even being seen to create ministries of truth or leading also to censorship. So this is why, in fact, we take a more comprehensive approach focusing on reinforcing information integrity rather than just tackling disinformation. By promoting policy action across three key clusters of three areas. The first one, it was mentioned already, is around building societal resilience. We all heard that society becomes increasingly exposed to a variety of information sources. It is critical that individuals are equipped with the necessary skills to navigate this complex landscape, enabling them to think independently and critically about what they see, what they share, what they create as well. Across OECD countries, there are a number of very good practices and examples of countries that have set up interesting media and information literacy programs, from Finland's nationwide media education policy to France's CNECT program that trains teachers so that they are able to bring this to students. These initiatives, they empower people of all ages to engage responsibly and navigate today's information spaces. On societal resilience, of course, the role of CSOs, academic, is also critical. It requires those organizations to support information integrity through analysis of the information landscape, evaluation of policies, grassroots initiative, and advocacy. The second pillar is a bit aligned with what was just presented by our colleagues in CNECT, is around increasing the transparency and accountability of information sources. And this dimension focuses on the structure of the media space, on the actors, both offline and online. It emphasizes the importance of a free, plural, sustainable press, of course, so that it can play its critical role as a watchdog for the public interests. The recommendation also recognizes the need for innovative policies and agile responses and governance mechanisms to address the major shifts in information spaces in the digital era, including the increasing use of AI. Here it is critical to avoid, I will say, focusing on content, but rather to incentivize transparent modus operandi by the actors in the information space, including online platforms, as several jurisdictions we just heard the EU have started to engage on. The third pillar, and perhaps, everyone talks a lot about the two I just mentioned, perhaps in my view is the one we do not talk enough about, is how can governments organize themselves, how to modernize the institutional setting to be able to play a constructive role in this space. The complexity of efforts to reinforce information integrity in democracies calls for establishing specific capabilities. We heard a bit about them this morning, and coordination mechanisms in governments along with appropriate checks and balances to ensure governments play a critical role and constructive role and transparent role in this space. As of 2023, only half of the OECD governments had established some forms of coordination mechanisms around information integrity. We can see coordination units or task forces that have been created to ensure policy coherence of their action to enforce information integrity. There are also specialized institutions. The EES presented its work. There's also Viginum in France, which is an interesting model, or the Swedish Psychological Defense Agencies. There are a few examples. We've seen the specific task force as well established in the context of elections, such as the one you set up in the UK with Home, FCDO, Cabinet Office, a number of stakeholders coordinating the action, and that's critical to be able to do that. So I think these are the three main areas I wanted to emphasize on. And just to say that this standard was established under the joint chairmanship of our work by France and the United States a year back. Our group is now co-chaired by the Netherlands and Canada, and we are moving towards now supporting countries to implement those provisions with a few projects. Like in the Netherlands, they want to set up a dedicated FIMI monitoring, detection and response structure that we are helping them to establish, while at the same time, of course, ensuring absolute freedom of expression and protection of privacy and personal data. So this is the kind of thing that we are now doing to implement solutions.
Fantastic. So that's really interesting. We've got a kind of different view across 3 really different areas about what is to be done. Finally, I'm going to turn to Damien Tambini. Distinguished academic, pulling that all together, how does that look from your point of view?
So I'm happy to give an academic perspective. I also should point out that I've been, over the years, formally and informally, also a consultant and advisor to the Commission, European Commission, to the UK government, Ofcom, and I've written a series of reports on this topic for the Council of Europe, which is not an institution we've discussed yet, and we should discuss more. I think we're at an inflection point. So we're moving from phase 1 of the response to what we call FIMI, but we have called disinfo, and we're moving towards a new phase. And I think that there is a danger, judging by the conversation so far this morning, that we're missing a key piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and we miss this at our peril, because it could lead to the failure of a lot of the systems which, as we just heard, governments and other institutions are trying to put in place. So the first phase of the response to FIMI had certain characteristics. It was focused on what we call bad actors, not in the Hugh Grant sense, but in the sense of identifiable actors that we think are doing bad stuff. There was a lot of disagreement about the definitions. We've struggled around, how do you describe this in senses which are justiciable, and that we can identify, and those identifications won't be challenged. There was a bias towards self-regulatory solutions, partly because of this problem of justiciable standards, and a tendency to ad hocery, if you like. So a lot of informal information exchange, and we can think about that in the emergency environment of the pandemic, for example, and the rollout of the vaccine. There was a lot of informal information exchange and a lot of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, blocking by platforms of disinformation, which was never really fully defined. So in this first phase, the danger is that we come up with solutions which are not based on legitimate criteria. There's no legal standard. They're open to challenge. And I disagree with some of the what I would see as really not really grasping the nettle views about free speech. There are clearly challenges coming from America around freedom of expression, claims that the new European regulatory framework is a challenge to freedom of expression, should be dismantled. This is happening at multiple levels. In the UK, there's an information war about the information war. The attempt to dismantle all of these frameworks, including all of the good monitoring that went on at EU versus Disinfo, for example. These are described as what they call the disinformation industrial complex, and they are attacks on free speech. And this is an aspect of the information warfare, which is driven by perceived industrial policy interests and foreign policy interests coming from the other side of the Atlantic. However, we're moving to this new phase where hopefully we can build legitimate institutions, because the key problem here is the legitimacy gap. It is the problem of creating institutions which do not have the support of civil society, and they do not, in many cases, meet established standards of freedom of expression under the European Convention on Human Rights. Article 10.2 of the European Convention on Human Rights says that restrictions on freedom of expression should be prescribed by law and necessary in a democratic society for a list of purposes. So the purposes are there, they include national security, but these are not restrictions which are prescribed by law. They're not according to a standard which is set by Parliament. So there are all sorts of problems with implementing what Carl in the first panel called for, which is this entrepreneurial disruption. So let's just think about entrepreneurial disruption from the point of view of the views of those who are maybe a little bit less trusting of institutions and a little bit less trusting of governments. Entrepreneurial disruption is censorship. Entrepreneurial disruption is blocking of speech. This needs to be based on clear criteria. So my hope is that as we move to this phase of more institutionalized and more permanent responses, because I think the other thing that we need to accept is that this is a permanent state of our new international relations. This is not a temporary moment in the doctrines of the three warfares, the five warfares and hybrid warfare say this is a permanent state now. So we do need permanent solutions which actually work within the existing human rights framework. So a final point, all is not lost because the Council of Europe has been doing a lot of work. So there are lots of standards that policymakers can refer to. The 2019 standard on manipulation by algorithmic processes, the standards on media governance from 2021, the standards on media pluralism from 2019. All of these things are a process of trying to work out how these new co-regulatory frameworks, including the Digital Services Act, can work within human rights standards. So when the next flood of disinformation about the information warfare being an attack on free speech comes, we need to be ready with a response which says we have standards. Article 10 is a little bit different to the First Amendment, but this is a European tradition which is based on legitimate standards, which is supported by over 1,000 cases on Article 10 in the European Court of Human Rights, and which is well developed, and which is shared, of course, by the way, by the United Kingdom, which is still a member of the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Fantastic. That is an awful lot to chew on in all of that. I'm going to turn over to you initially, Leah, because there is a lot here on regulation. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it, referred to by a couple of people, not least Phil, are you getting the kind of cooperation from the platforms that enables the DSA to be as effective as the architects of it hoped?
I would cautiously say yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's relatively new, but I think, in terms of engagement, yes. I think in terms of bringing more transparency, having more information on how things are working, and not only for us, but also, as you said, access to data for researchers. We also have a framework for that, public data, vetted researchers. So it's definitely a part of the framework. And then, of course, we opened a number of cases against platforms. I mean, I can mention here X, TikTok, Meta, which are opened now for some time. I very much hope that they will be closed soon, and then they can also show, in terms of good practices, bad practices, where we're going with this.
Thank you. Phil, turning to you, looking at the frameworks that you've been working within and looking at the trajectory of AI in the coming year, Do you see a change coming in terms of what your members, what your scientists will be seeing, and what the policy response should be?
That's a very good question. I think I would say the research community is catching more of the junk, AI-generated junk, and there's blooms of this kinds of activity around elections or complex humanitarian disasters, wars. Those are the occasions in which we catch the junk. I'd say that the more concerning trend for us is the very serious chilling effect on independent research. I mentioned this expert survey that we'll be releasing next week. 3/4 of the respondents reported self-censorship, political interference in their research, loss of funding, a whole series of things that are effectively choking off our ability to independently do the tracking and investigative work that we've been talking about so far. So of the things I'm worried about for next year, it's looking for ways to take advantage of the instruments that are available. And in this important way, I do think the DSA and the AI Act are two of the most important instruments for protecting political speech globally. In an important way, the mechanism is just set up for Europe, but I think there is a Brussels effect that will come from this kinds of policy, and that many kinds of democracies will benefit by the kinds of changes that the platforms may be forced to do under the direction of the enforcement actions from the DSA. So I'm a fan. I'm worried about the chilling effect. The important battle, there's many battlegrounds we've talked about today. One of them is for next year's voters, right? So it's the information flows that are the teenagers are getting now that we also need to be worried about. And without the ability to do the independent research, we're not going to be able to track how future generations are getting their news and information.
Thank you, Phil. Very briefly, before we turn this over to you for questions, so please have a think about what questions you might want to ask this panel. Damien, how should the EU and the UK think about working more closely together in this area in the coming year?
Well, I've already mentioned that we have the benefit of the Council of Europe standards, which provide a common reference point. But I argued that the key challenge is the legitimacy gap, and how to build trust in these new institutions and reassure the public that this is not a form of censorship which is going to operate against the interests of those citizens. There is a lot of collaboration going on currently between EU and UK researchers, because we now have the benefit of the Horizon programme being reopened, and there are a number of projects and proposals in train to help UK and European scientists align on collaborating around, what are the effects of the implementation of DSA and also the Online Safety Act. What are those underlying principles and objectives that are being implemented in these regulatory frameworks, and of course, how do they relate to the existing constitutional standards, which are indeed supported by Parliament, which enjoy that legitimacy. But I think there's also a bottom-up piece, which is, I was fascinated by Conrad's description in the last panel of what's happening in Poland with this kind of proactive community debates about international affairs. And that's one of the things I've been arguing for some time in order to correct the legitimacy gap, is that we should be using those instruments like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, to really actually proactively communicate that these, what seem to be censorship exercises, are in fact based on accepted standards, which are based on long-term history of freedom of speech, and whatever certain populist politicians might say, even in the US Congress a few weeks ago, the United Kingdom is adhering to those standards, just as its partners in Europe are adhering to those standards, which are very clear, as they deploy these new policy frameworks.
Fantastic. Very briefly, Charles, thinking about the UK and the EU working more closely together in this area, very briefly, what should they be doing that they're not already doing?
I mean, we heard already quite a lot about information sharing on FIMI tactics, tools. I think also learning from each other, not only on the operational aspects, but also on the policies. We heard a lot about the EU instruments, but there's also the UK Online Safety Act. There are other policy instruments that are set up across jurisdictions. Those instruments are quite new, and they are meant to adapt to the new information space that is evolving very fast with technology as well. So I think here thinking together about how to have the agile approaches that enables those instruments to be really valuable, to evolve over time, including, as you mentioned, through co-regulation with platforms. I mean, you need to discuss with them. At the end of the day, it's also the technology is evolving so fast that you need to have an informed dialogue to be able to think through the right instruments. So I think here, obviously, the UK started that, for instance, on AI with the AI Summit, and I think that was then replicated elsewhere in other countries. These are the kind of things that the UK and the EU can really work on.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we're going to now turn it over to questions. Please be really concise in the questions that you ask and tell us who you are and where you're from. And there will be roving mics. So if you could put your hand up and then a mic will find you. Can we go first over here to Gina?
Thank you for this great panel. I'm Gina Neff. I run the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy at Cambridge. And I'm part of one of those great Horizon Europe programs, AI for Trust, that's working on building an early detection tool for mis and disinformation across European languages. The challenge we're having is data. And it's not about sharing data across the UK and across our EU member country partner researchers. It's getting platform data that we've got a legal framework for and we haven't done anything about. How can we advocate more strongly for that mechanism of data sharing through the DSA to be implemented?
I think, Lena, that one's got your name on it.
No, I mean, yeah, you're right. We have a framework, and I think, you know, we have also, and now it needs to be implemented, and it needs to work. It needs to work in practice. I think we also have some investigations opened, you know, with some of the platforms that haven't been cooperative in this regard. But I understand that a lot can also be done outside. You know, you have soft and hard implementation. I mean, the only thing I can say is keep the pressure, you know. I understand and I hope, and it will take some time maybe, you know, with the fines and the decisions and this and that to come to some kind of a solution. But I think, you know, researchers coming together with the civil society, but also with users. Again, I think if the users see the real benefit of what comes out of this research and what comes out from this data, I think that will help.
Okay, so you're saying the implementation of the regulation, both through fines and through user asserting their rights,
yes,
is going to
yes.
open the door for Gina.
I hope so.
You hope so. Brilliant. Thank you. More questions. This gentleman over here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sohan D'Souza from Max Planck Institute for Human Development. I have a question about malicious compliance or up-to-the-line compliance used by many of these tech platforms. An example I can give is Facebook's obligation to give sponsor and beneficiary information about advertisers. And what they do is they just let the advertiser use the name of a page, which can be like a burner page or something like that, and don't even link to the actual page. So things like this where they walk right up to the line. I'm wondering, like, given this and many other examples, is there like a sense that perhaps in the next iteration, if there will be one, there will be a more attention given to kind of strategically, like thinking about how platforms might try to game something like this, like Google deleting, the political ad archive of EU and things like that, strategically preempting these. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's a very technical question, and again, I'm afraid only Leah can answer it, so very briefly.
Not even. No, but I mean, it's difficult for me to, comment on some specific practices and whether, going forward, I think we will also, because you seem to indicate that the DSA should somehow be amended also, but I think, in general, any circumvention of any obligations has to be looked into. So I think that's quite clear. But then we can, of course, with the review coming up in 2027, see if something needs to be amended, if something needs to be improved. But it's difficult for me to.
Of course, Phil.
I'd only offer that I agree and that we as researchers, as scientists, don't even fully understand how the data is structured. And the way to get there is probably through tort actions in the US context and the enforcement actions. Until we're able to see what it is they won't share, it's hard to know what to ask for, because we've had 15, 20 years of asking for access and getting right up to the margins of what's expected.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Other questions? This gentleman here. Thank you. If you could say who you are and where you're from, and a concise question, that would be great.
Thank you so much for the talk. So I'm Oscar, I'm a French student at King's College London. I'm also co-directing the French Youth Institute for Higher National Defense Studies. So my question comes to, you mentioned that government should make more to respond to those threats. So I just saw that the French government launched the French response, which is like an account on social media to be more offensive on the response that they have on disinformation threats. My question is, how can we measure how such narrative from government are received by societies? And the second question is, how do you say to people who claim that such response, instead of tackling disinformation, gives echo chamber to the misinformation that they are trying to tackle? Thank you.
Interesting. And Damien, that sort of, it's a legitimacy gap question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should kind of think quite long-term thinking about this. And I'm going to come back to your specific point. But one of the things about, this more offensive capability discussion and taking a more proactive whole of society approach, I think the next panel is going to discuss that, is not only about this question of identifying the bad stuff. I would say that it also needs to incorporate fostering the good stuff and ensuring that rises to the top. So both in the EU and in the UK, we have new legal supports, for example, for prominence of public service media. And we can see in the next phase they may be expanded to cover not only on-demand, video on-demand type services, but also maybe other platforms, even social media in time. And they might also cover a wider spectrum of content types. So not only public service media, but also trusted journalism, for example, may be according to a decentralized civil society-led kite mark, for example. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can have a more proactive response. But I wouldn't like this to be within if you like, a kind of a defense framing. If we think back to the post-war period, if we think back to the 45 to 55 period and how those very successful pro-democracy media systems were set up across Europe, but also in occupied Japan, there was a deliberate attempt to create a minimum of media pluralism, to restrict editorializing and propaganda in a way that fostered the ability of citizens to make their own minds up about politics. And we need to have a debate on that scale about what is a resilient pro-democracy media system. It's a big, decade-long task, but it needs to be done deliberately and proactively, as it was done by the Royal Commission on the Press, the Hutchins Commission in the US, and all of the institution building that went on in that period.
Yeah, and the public service broadcasters, of course.
That as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is true that every study said, I'm sure you will agree with that, Philip, is that pre-banking is much more efficient than the banking, and everyone was kind of afraid of this echo chamber effect that you refer to. But it doesn't mean that public institutions should not play the role of public communication. I mean, they have this role as well to play, and I think this creation of a new account on Twitter just demonstrates that they are stepping up their game. They are now using the tools, the technological, they show that they can use these technologies as well, so they have invested in technological capabilities to be able to do it well. Which I think everyone should do. I mean, today, if you want to, I was saying about building institutions, you mentioned their legitimacy, but there's a very big point around the capabilities and the capacities. You need to hire the right people. You need to have in government a data scientist, AI specialist that can help you understand this landscape, find the right responses. Even if you want to have some more, sophisticated policy instruments like the DSA or other ones, you need to have good capacities in your regulatory bodies as well, so that they understand well the context, they can make the right decisions and so on. So that's a very critical point, and I think the creation of this account demonstrates that they're advancing in that direction.
Thank you. And very briefly, Phil, what works in terms of what you've heard about what the French are proposing? What would you guide them in terms of the evidence base?
I think what works especially is when this kind of government-led initiative, public interest initiative, is tied to a public interest issue like health. So there are some domains where, particularly public health, you want to hear from the nation's doctors. You want to hear. People need to understand that medical consensus evolves, right? So there's some education we need to do about how science works. It's not a list of facts. It's a process. But public health would be, for example, one domain in which I think we would want to hear from the nation's health agencies.
Fantastic. Lovely. Thank you. Can we have some more questions? Carl seems to have a question.
Hey, Damien. Thanks for your thoughts. I always enjoy listening to what you got to say. But I'm not sure you quite understood what I was saying. So I wasn't calling for disruption in any way to at all be about what people are saying. It's not about the content, and I think we've really moved away from that. Like, who we need to be disrupt on, it has to be on the basis of who they are. And we have now clear legal mechanisms and definitions for this. The National Security Act has created a criminal offence for people to essentially be doing various kinds of information interference, knowingly on behalf of a foreign power. There's clear legal definitions and mechanisms in sanctioning. There's clear legal mechanisms when it comes to like financial responses. The Russian SVR does not have speech rights in the Moldovan election. The PRC does not have speech rights to run a cadre of covert Wikipedia editors, and a for-profit actor does not have speech rights to set up hundreds of thousands of websites to manipulate LLM. Okay. So this is not about censorship at all. This is about trying to deny bad actors the ability to manipulate our information spaces.
Okay, Carl, very briefly, Damien, are you convinced?
Thank you, Carl, for clarifying that the category is not as broad as I feared. That's a good challenge. In my defence, I was asked by the organisers to find people to disagree with, because people on the panel are agreeing far too much. But I think the point stands that we do need to be very, very clear about those legal definitions, and that this does not go broader, and it cannot be perceived to go broader than it does. And also within the EU, particularly at a time of political instability, there may be governments, and there have been governments in the last decade, that have not really respected the fundamental rights of EU citizens when it comes to freedom of expression. And that may be more the case in the future. We need to be aware of that.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Any other questions? This gentleman over here.
Hello, I'm Anthony O'Brien. I am a student at Royal Holloway. And I was just looking at, when you look at differing sort of industrial and social policies across the OECD and the wider global community, how optimistic are you of real consensus and deeper cooperation on managing on disinformation, particularly when you look in Western democracies such as the UK, where groups continually sort of attack these global and domestic institutions, calling them sort of illegitimate and so on and so forth. So is there optimism in the global community for real cooperation?
Charles.
Well, I think what we all heard in this panel, and perhaps a bit earlier as well, is that we can have a little bit of a note of optimism. Because, I mean, it's been like a decade that FIMI is out of the shelves of the Cold War, and we see all those tactics trying to influence our democracies. But what we hear now, even though I think democracies have taken perhaps a bit of a long time to understand this threat and find the right responses, we can see now there's more and more ideas, responses, policies, capacities that are being set up. And it is growing. It is growing across most OECD members, for instance. And so that gives me a note of hope. And the second note of hope is that I think also that citizens ask for appropriate responses from governments. More and more as well. So yeah, a note of hope, and perhaps also a note of caution, because indeed we are democracies who are setting up the tools, the responses. We always need to bear in mind that those tools that we are setting up, they can be easily perverted in non-democratic contexts, and that's a point of very important caution, I will say.
Yeah. Are you
I fully agree. I am optimistic, and I fully agree what Charles has said. Just to add that indeed we have to be cautious, and we as the Commission in the and again, I think Digital Services Act is just one of the pieces of the many things that we are working on in different jurisdictions as well. But we do need to be cautious because this will lead to decisions that will be challenged in courts. I mean, I've used to work in competition law. I know how these things end. So, on the one hand, yes, we need to go, we need to enforce, we need to be more efficient. But on the other hand, I completely agree that we need to take quite a cautious approach and not let this be perverted into something that it's not.
Phil, answer that question from your point of view.
Thank you. Yes, I am optimistic. I think FIMI has become such a powerful framework for us, and that there's some strong consensus that it provides great analytical frame. If we allow ourselves to think about FIMI 2.0 or take the next step, I think there may also be wide recognition that some of our democratic allies are generating misinformation. The gorgeous map of the galaxy of some of those nodes are democratic allies, right? But remain unlabeled. And then in each country there are domestic actors who echo, parrot, shill, try to sell baseball hats and T-shirts, and take Sputnik content or take RT content, and repurpose. We need to work towards consensus on how to treat those kinds of actors in the framework.
Thank you. And finally, Damien.
I think it was Gramsci, wasn't it, who said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We have to stay optimistic. And for me, that means really being proactive in what I called the information war about the information wall. So this flood of challenges to governance, to regulation, to the implementation of our human rights standards in the form of the weaponization of free speech. And by that, I don't mean propaganda, just PR claiming that we meet our standards. I mean the hard work of actually making sure that we do meet our standards, those standards of the Council of Europe, and that these are fully implemented, and that people are aware of those, and that, as I mentioned, needs to be both top-down and bottom-up. We need to involve civil society and the public.
Fantastic. Do we have more questions? We've got a gentleman over there.
I'm Colin Gordon from the European Movement UK, a civil society organisation. Two questions. One is, are we in a war? And is a war the same thing as a legitimation crisis? And secondly, is the EU about to rethink the F in FIMI so that it realises it's not only dealing with bad actors who are foreign?
Okay, Leah, are we in a war, and are all the bad actors foreign?
I would, yeah. No, I wouldn't say so. No, I wouldn't say we are at a war. I mean, again, for me, it's a little bit difficult to speak about the more general landscape. As I said, we are really focused on transparency, on due process. The DSA doesn't say what is illegal, what is not illegal, but we want platforms to put systems in place to give researchers access to data so that all these things become more transparent, and then people can decide for themselves.
Okay, thank you. Phil, are we in a war, and are all bad actors foreign?
Not all bad actors are foreign. My dodge on the war question would be to say that we are in a kind of epistemic war, a knowledge-based war, to defend how we generate evidence and deliver it to policymakers. That process is clearly under attack by actors who don't want to be fact-checked, don't like evidence to appear with policymakers. And so shoring up those epistemic routes by which we generate the knowledge. It's also worth pointing out that we may be at war in the sense that the first institutional victims in democracies are civil society groups and science bodies. So research funding is down across the board. Public science agencies now expect in almost every country some kind of industry partnership. So basic science for itself is under serious pressure, even at the ERC. The number of civil society groups and science bodies that work on the things that we do that are collapsing for lack of funding only grows. So the serious casualties right now are in the civil society groups. I think we're pegging some hope to. Yeah, that's part of public life that we need to defend now.
Charles, same question to you.
I mean, there are clearly increased geopolitical competition, that's for sure, competing narratives as well. There's a clear will to undermine the democratic model of governance by a number of authoritarian regimes. But if you talk about war, I would say Ukraine is at war. And what is interesting in light of, to create a link with our discussion today is what Ukraine has been setting up in terms of its response to FIMI attacks. I think this is quite inspirational to see that despite the war context, they've tried their best to maintain the checks and balances that a democracy requires when it has an active role in the information sphere. I think there are many lessons also in terms of the technology that they have developed for our democracies as well. That's how I would respond to you. Yeah.
And finally, Damien, are we at war, and are all bad actors foreign?
I was reflecting on the word we, in fact, being asked by the European movement in post-Brexit Britain, and you're asking a Irish-Italian Brit. at an event organised by the European Commission, effectively. So who is the we, I think is complex. And I think it's also very, very contested at the moment in this era of shifting strategic alliances, the European political community, and the attempt to create foreign policy coherence with the United Kingdom in Europe. But in many ways, we have a choice. As I said, a lot of the kind of theories of hybrid warfare and hybrid and information warfare would claim that there is no longer any difference between the state of war and the state of peace. This is a continual use of different tools of warfare, and clearly Ukraine is in a kinetic war. But I think there's a sense in which we need to have the urgency in terms of policy that reflect a state of war or near warfare. But there is a sense in which the framing of warfare is not helpful. It's not helpful if we see this in terms of attacks on our adversaries' information ecosystems and defense, including restrictions on freedom of expression of our own information ecosystems. If defending our own information ecosystems involves reducing our standards of freedom of expression, be clear, we are surrendering in that fight for democracy. So we need to act with the urgency that we're in war, but we need to do so with those peacetime standards of freedom of expression and open societies. And I think that is possible, but we do need to be proactive in order to do that.
Thank you. I think that is a very good place to end for lunch. Thank you for an amazing panel and a really, really interesting discussion. There is a delicious lunch downstairs, and we would like everyone back, please, for 1:15 sharp, when we'll start the afternoon with the whole of society approach. But before that, can you thank our wonderful panel?